This video is sponsored by Tokyo Treat and Sakura Co. More on them a little later. Kuki Shinobu was released as the laughingstock of the game, with any role she attempted to provide being pretty much a complete downgrade to other options. With the release of Dendro, however, it became immediately clear that she was simply a unit released before her time. Her ability to provide consistent electro application, being rewarded for building full EM, and her ability to thus roll consolidate, healing, and hyper bloom triggering has made her the best 4-star to be added to the game post-launch, in my opinion of course, and her synergy with Dendro making her almost a must build for your account. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Tokyo Treat delivers the most premium Japanese snacks and candies to your door monthly. From the salty, sour to the sweet, discover limited edition Japanese treats that you won't find anywhere else. It was such a treat for my wife and I to enjoy these snacks together. Nearly everything in it were things that I had never tried before, such as the sour cream potato crackers, which were a delicious and unique savory treat, and things that made my wife nostalgic for when she herself lived in Japan, such as the snowball marshmallow, which is filled with a delicious Japanese bean paste filling, very common to snacks from there. This month's box is the Christmas edition, and it's perfect for a loved one's gift. My wife and I are getting 2 of our friends these very boxes. Sakura Co. focuses on authentic Japanese sweets, snacks, and teas. The family-owned businesses are handpicked by Sakura Co. themselves. This month's selection is Holidays in Hokkaido and featured an incredible milk mochi, which tasted unique to even any mochi I've ever had and is a new favorite treat of mine. The Hokkaido Adzuki cake was also delicious, filled with a refined red bean paste, which also made my wife very nostalgic for Japan. It was also very special to learn about each snack through the included pamphlet, learning about the process to make each treat and the history behind it. It's also amazing to receive this unique and beautiful handmade crafted artisan indigo Eisen dish. Don't forget to use the code below to get $5 off your first box through my link. You can't go wrong getting either box as a gift for a loved one or for yourself. Thanks again to Tokyo Treat and Sakura Co. for sponsoring this video. Kuki is an off-field electro applicator and healer who does the majority of her team function just by using her skill once per rotation. She takes her own HP similar to Hu Tao and gets more healing when she's under 50%. This mechanic can make her a bit fragile, especially for a defensive unit, so make sure to be ready to dodge when using her, as she will often be at pretty low HP. Kuki's biggest boon is her passive that converts elemental mastery into healing, meaning you can run full EM while still having enough healing to keep your team healthy, allowing you to maximize hyper bloom damage while being your defensive unit. Her skill with C2 has permanent uptime and a pretty good range that doesn't even require your character to proc reactions by using normal attacks or something, or any attacks for that matter. You could be being knocked around or just running around with Yao Yao, rolling around with Sayu, or crawling around with Kirara, and her skill keeps going. Her burst doesn't have too much use, but it can be slotted into your rotation when available to proc additional blooms, apply extra electro for officials A4, or for just a tiny bit of extra damage, or to activate certain weapon passives. All this together makes her one of the ideal triggers for Hyper Bloom in the game, which of course is one of the best teams in the game and almost definitely the best team at low investment and often medium investment too. Kuki does have a few teams outside of Hyper Bloom, which we will cover as well, but Hyper Bloom is definitely where her kit shines the most. All in all, she's extremely free to play friendly, very powerful, provides great role consolidation, doesn't require high constellations, and all considered, she's arguably the best procer of the most powerful low and mid investment team in the game, so it's easy to see why she's nearly a must build on your account. Let's talk about exactly what teams she's best in and when she is and isn't the best options on those teams. Of course, we've already talked so much about the Hyper Bloom team, so the main core is going to be a Dendro unit, usually Nahida, but any Dendro unit will do. You generally want them to have the most Dendro application possible to give you the best chance of creating the most seeds, so Nahida is of course the best. Baiju, using him on field is generally great, although using him with Kuki is a bit redundant because both of them of course provide healing. You might as well free up this slot for someone else, but if you just want to use Baiju with Kuki, of course you can. The next is a Hydro. This is going to be Yelan or Sing Cho, 99.9% of the time. Kokomi can work, but the Hydro application's a lot less, so you don't get nearly as many blooms. It's not as good. And you can also now use Farina. That changes things a little bit. We'll get to that in a second, but this is basically your main three. And if you don't have Yolanda, you're going more free to play, it's going to be Xingqiu. The final slot really can be your pick of the litter. You can choose Xingqiu and Yolanda to make double Hydro. This team has never failed to clear the Abyss. It's just an unbelievably good team. You can also use Fischl. She's fantastic here. Doesn't interrupt Hyper Blooms, and you get tons of aggravates for her, so it's great. You can even use something like Sucrose. It's not like the craziest team for Sucrose, but anything that doesn't mess up the rest of the reaction is going to work here, because the rest of the team is so strong. Like, you can put Wanderer here, you can put Yaimiko here, you can put Kaching here, like, you can just do whatever. This 3-team core is so strong that it gives you so much flexibility for that last one. Like, Yoimiya has no synergy here. Yeah, Yoimiya has no synergy here. In fact, she has anti-synergy. She should be stealing some Hyper Blooms from here, but I just wanted to take it to the Abyss and just get an idea of how strong or weak this anti-synergy actually is, because even though we have anti-synergy, I think it's pretty funny that if we can actually clear the Abyss with something that doesn't make any sense. So we're using our usual Hyper Bloom rotation, and we're just gonna see how it compares to other Hyper Bloom. Normally, I can one rotate this pretty close with a good Hyper Bloom team before it goes into its next phase. So we'll see if this team is able to do that. It looks like we're lacking ER on my Yolanda. She's probably using Aqua and doesn't have enough ER, so that's not so great. It could be that we would be in a better place if we had more ER. So let's see where it finishes off. Yeah, I mean, I know this is kind of goofy, right? The team makes no sense. Yoimiya actively steals blooms from the team, but the reality is that the core is just so broken that you can use something that hurts the team and just adds damage in a different way, and the team is still going to perform fine. So I just wanted to show that, so that, like, I talk about meta, I talk about what's strong and what's not strong, and it's important that everyone knows that if you know how to play the game and you know how to build your units well, that you can do things that are not optimal and that are actively anti-synergistic and still clap the Abyss's cheeks completely. And this team is one of those cheat codes that you can just throw stuff in there and have a lot of fun using anyone on field. Like, I've cleared with this team at level 1 from an A before, but you can, this is where you can have fun. Like, you can put Hazo in front here. You can do like physical Amber or something goofy like that. Like, cryo units are very common in this slot, like Chongyun or Charlotte for a Hyper Fridge, right? This is what's called Hyper Fridge. Hyper Fridge isn't real. Like, it's not an optimal team pretty much in any sense of the word, in pretty much any scenario, unless for some reason you need both the cryo element and the Dendro, but Dendro shreds cryo, like Hydro shields anyway, so there's no even reason to have cryo on your team pretty much ever. It does provide some nice freeze and some nice crowd control, and it can give you a few more blooms, but it's almost never better than just using something else for damage. But like, this is where you'd put in Kave. This, if you want to use Kave on field, you'd want to put him in something like this team, and it's going to do well. You can put Ayato, you can put Kokomi, you can put Lisa, you can put Razor. This is like this is like the team that says, I have a favorite character, they're maybe not well invested enough to clear the Abyss, but I still want to use them. This is the team to do it. Oh, and if you want the absolute ceiling option, then Alhaitham is gonna be that for you. Not only is his vertical investment potential the highest, so good artifacts, you know, 5-star weapon like the Jade Cutter or something, this team scales really, really well, but also it has a lot of front-loaded damage with Alhaitham's burst. So although it's in theory very, very close to double Hydro and often performs very similarly, the front load of Alhaitham just makes this sort of the peak Hyper Bloom team. But there is another variant where you switch out the Hydro for Furina, and when you do that, Kuki's healing is not quite enough to gain all the stacks back, and so that's where you want to go onto your Nahida and give her the prototype Amber weapon, and then you'll have enough healing to proc Furina, and Furina gives added damage to Alhaitham. You want to build Nahida on full damage, as much damage as you can get out of her, so she'll be doing good damage on this team. And overall, I don't know if this is better than using Yolanda in the Furina slot. It really probably depends on how well built your Alhaitham is and how well built your Nahida is. This team definitely scales with the vertical investment of your carries and your just the damage overall. And as usual, Kuki's just on EM. You also have the ability to play a very similar team with Tighnari. I've got Baiju here for some interruption resistance, but the Dendro app being reduced is very noticeable. If you want good feeling damage, you do want to use Nahida instead. This is the first time Tighnari's been able to actually use a Hyper Bloom team, so that's really awesome. And it's the same as the Alhaitham one, but it's just sort of more single target restricted. But Tighnari has excellent single target, and Hyper Bloom is single target, so it does make sense, and you're getting a lot. Again, high investment on your Tighnari is what you want for this team. But she doesn't have to be used on Hyper Bloom. You can use her on Aggravate, and she has some very serious upsides to be using on this team. On this team, you want to generally use the Instructor's artifact set, I'll show you it later, and a buffing weapon, so either a 5-star buffing weapon or the Sapwood Blade if you're free to play. And she is one of the better defensive options for a Hytham spread. Zhongli is another option as well, but Kuki can often be the optimal choice for damage, especially if you have something like the key for buffing. Doesn't have to be Alhaitham, of course. Tighnari is excellent here as well. She can also be used for super conduct, something like a Eula team or a Razor team. I guess not so much Razor, really it's going to be Eula or Fremine. And this team definitely doesn't have the ceiling that Hyperbloom does, but especially for the Overworld, or if you've just got extremely cracked out artifacts for the Abyss, then this is a good option as well. What this allows you to do is go for more offensive options for your cryo support. So I'm using Rosaria and Shenhe here. You'll want to see this team really pop off. You'll want your Rosaria to be really well invested for damage. You'll want to see Eula really well invested. Generally, it's going to be an overall downgrade to using some of the better teams, like using Zhongli. Even on this team, Zhongli is often going to be the better choice and the more comfortable choice. But Kuki is definitely an option that at least has some synergy here. This is another version of Aggravate that I didn't try until recently, and I really love this team. I don't love it as much as just using a defensive option in the Nahida slot here and then using another Animo like Venti or something in the Kuki slot, but it still is a really good team. You once again want to put Kuki on Instructors, give her Sapwood Blade, and you want to put Kazuha on Sacrificial Sword so you can use his skill often. The main problem with this team with Nahida is that sometimes she applies too much Dendro and it's hard to get your Electro Swirls with Kazuha, so you might want to infuse his burst to have that extra application before you start applying Nahida's skill. I also wanted to make sure I gave a shout out to my favorite funny team, which is called Hopper Bloom. This is a team where you set up your Farina, set up your Kuki, set up your Fischl, and just jump around with Yao Yao. You don't do any normal attack, you don't do any charge attacks, you just hop around and the enemies die, and it's the most hilarious and funny thing ever. If you like funny teams like that, by the way, check out my video, Top 10 4-star teams for Farina. It was a really good video, but it didn't do all that well, so go check it out if you want to see more creative team videos like that. And finally, although it's less optimal, you can use her in something like a Taser team. The problem is, for most Taser teams, you're gonna want to go with a Xingqiu and Beidou core, and Xingqiu and Beidou is really all the defensive utility you need for an Electro team. So slotting in Kuki instead of Beidou or instead of Fischl just results in losing a lot of damage for not really that much gain. And when you start changing up the team to be more offensive, let's say you want to put Raiden and Kazuha and Yelan in there or something, and then you're like, okay, now I need a healer. It's like, well, you should have just put Bennett in that last slot or something for more buffing and give up on this on the Taser archetype. So generally, Kuki just doesn't seem to fit that well into Taser due to offensive Electro just being better, similarly to Super Conduct, but it's definitely there and definitely something you can do. And if you are like a creative individual and you've been thinking about using like Super Conduct Kuki and like making use of her normal attack, you're gonna have much better mileage just using her on field in the Hyper Bloom team. Like if you love Kuki, just use her on field in the Hyper Bloom team. Use Xingqiu on the team for damage reduction so that you don't die, and she'll take advantage from her own healing. So if you love Kuki and you want to see her on field, just on field her in the Hyper Bloom team. It's going to be great. Final thing. I know this is super cope, but it is really funny. So hear me out. This is a team where you on field Kuki in a Hyper Bloom team, and you start with Nahida, so you get Nahida's buff and her skill, and you get the EM buff from Nahida, and you use Kuki on field so she takes advantage of the EM buff from Nahida, and you're using Candace to infuse Kuki's normal attacks with Hydro, meaning you get more Hydro application. And so this could be a team that you use if you want to use one of your Hydros on the other side. You don't want to just use double Hydro Hyper Bloom. Now you can use Candace and use Kuki on field, taking advantage of the EM buff. Anyways, definitely not the greatest team of all time, but definitely one that you can do. For her build guide, the main thing you want to consider is what team you're using her with. For Hyper Bloom, you definitely need her to be level 90. She gets about a 30% damage increase to the Hyper Blooms going from 80 to 90. It is a massive deal. Outside of Hyper Bloom, if you just use her as a healer, her personal damage is low enough that leaving her 80 out of 80, even not ascended, is going to be fine. But I suspect most of you are going to be doing Hyper Bloom, and for that, 90 is necessary. For talents, the only one you need to worry about is her skill, and you only need to level it up enough as to how much healing healing you need. Apparently I like to live on the edge, so I only have mine at level 6. Now that Farina's out, I'm probably going to take this much higher because more healings mean more stacks for Farina's buff, but there's no need to level up her normals or burst at all. For her artifacts, this is where it really depends again whether or not you're using Hyper Bloom or a different team. For Hyper Bloom, Flowers of Paradise Lost is her best set. The 4-piece increases Hyper Bloom damage by a substantial amount, but you really lose very little going with the Gilded Dreams instead. It's under a 5% damage increase. You kind of get diminishing returns for Elemental Mastery at some point, so the extra Elemental Mastery you get from Gilded Dreams is not quite as good as what you get from Flowers with the bonus, but they're so close that if you already have a Gilded Dream set, like there's really no need to go for the Flowers of Paradise. Even still, like I would really never recommend someone actually farm the Flowers of Paradise Lost. I did it because I wanted the 2-piece HP for Nilou, but the Gilded is just so much more efficient because you can get it with Deepwood, and with such a small difference, I think it's closer to 2% or something like that. It also depends on how many Elemental Mastery substats you can get and stuff like that, so it does depend a little, but overall just stick with Gilded unless you're really just trying to min-max. You can also go 2-piece, so 2-piece Gilded, 2-piece Flowers, 2-piece Gilded, 2-piece Wanderer's Troop. It's obviously worse than Gilded Dreams, but you're doing so much damage from Hyper Bloom that it doesn't matter. It's definitely much lower on your priorities list than getting to 90, getting your other characters proper artifacts. Like I would focus on your other characters first, then you can focus on getting her a full set. 2-piece is going to be totally fine in the meantime. For stats, definitely Elemental Mastery Sands, Elemental Mastery Goblet, Elemental Mastery Hat, and that's your Hyper Bloom build. If you're not using her on Hyper Bloom, then you want to go Instructors. A lot of the clips you saw in this video, I forgot to take Instructors off, so if I'm getting lower Hyper Bloom damage than I should, it's because I left Instructors on. Also, I was healing less than I should, so that's pretty funny. But Instructors is awesome when you're using an Aggravate team or a spread team with Alhaitham, because boosting your party's Elemental Mastery by 120 is really huge. It's a very easy set for her to proc, and it's just generally very useful for your team. And you'll usually just want to go HP to maximize her healing, or HP healing bonus, sorry, for the hat. But I'm using HP and it's totally fine. For weapons, Hyper Bloom, again, you want to go with an EM weapon. So I'm using the Tukabu Jigiri, but the Iron Sting is also a great choice. Black Iron Sword is a super underrated option that you can use. You get it for free in Leeway. The drip is insane with Black Iron Sword. So if you don't want to craft one of your sword billets, then Dark Iron Sword is like an incredible choice. And if you weren't around for that event, it's not that much lower of a substat, and the Elemental Mastery difference is pretty much negligible. So if you want it for the drip or to save your billets, then Dark Iron Sword's an amazing choice. If you have access to 5-star swords, Freedom Sworn is really good. Gives the largest Elemental Mastery substat in the game and has a nice buffing effect. So Freedom Sworn's incredible choice if you have it. Key of Kajna Suit, usually going to be an overall better choice on a lot of teams. Maybe not usually, but it's a better choice in a lot of teams because of the buffing effect. It just depends on what team you're running. Although it doesn't have an Elemental Mastery substat, it buffs her own Elemental Mastery as well. And it gives you boosted healing, which increase stacks for Farina, so and overall just comfort. So Key of Kajna Suit, the choice you want to go for overall if you have it. By the way, to make full use of the passive of the key, you do need to have her Constellation 4. So if you don't have her Constellation 4, you may not want to use this weapon. Just something to keep in mind. Zyphos Moonlight, if you happen to have it, is an incredible weapon. I've yet been unable to get a copy. Hopefully one day. It's basically just a better version of Iron Sting or the Umbrella because it also gives energy recharge to your team. I did forget one thing. If you're running a full healer build just for like superconduct teams or something like that, then Tenacity of the Millilith is the way you want to go. The set is very broken. It gives a really noticeable buff. The attack it gives is not to be understated. If you're running on a Eula team or something like that, then Tenacity is the best choice. For vertical investment, we obviously talked about the 5-star weapons. Constellations, not something you want to aim for. C2, increasing the skill duration by 3 seconds, gives her 100% uptime. That is really good. You definitely do want to go for that C2. C4 only really matters for the key. And then C6, a nice quality of life. I don't have it, so I can't speak to how it really feels. Like, what if you get hit twice in quick succession? Is it properly useful? I mean, the Elemental Mastery is nice, but not really super relevant. Definitely not something to go for. Definitely not something you need, but a nice bonus if you happen to get it. Versus others, her main point of competition is Raiden Shogun when you use her as just a skill bot. Raiden has the advantage of being able to be further away from the enemy when it's proc. So if you're using Novelette Hyper Bloom, which I neglected to talk about in my Hyper Bloom section, but Novelette Hyper Bloom is awesome. And if you want to be like really far away from the enemy, using someone like Raiden and Novelette Hyper Bloom can be really good. Raiden technically gives a buff to the ultimates of all the characters and can technically proc a couple more seeds, but in practice, the buff is 90% nice, but if you still have to run a healer in the team, then you're gonna, and Kuki normally is that healer slot for you, so you can run more offensive options on your other teams. That buff that Raiden has will not outpace Kuki's role consolidation of taking up the healer slot. So I guess if you can play without a healer, then yeah, Raiden is always going to be better, but otherwise she's only practically better in maybe a team like this. And even then, Kuki does have the benefit of not needing a normal or charge attack or any sort of attack to function. So sort of meme builds like Sayu or Yao Yao only work with Kuki. In practice, I basically never build Raiden on EM, not only because I find it blasphemous towards the God of Thunder to not use her burst, but also because I don't like to switch around artifacts, and I just rather have Kuki always on EM and then Raiden always on damage. But Raiden also does have the benefit of her skill lasting a lot longer, which actually is relevant because I definitely notice sometimes my rotations aren't super tight, and so I'll miss some hyper blooms doing the rotation because her ring doesn't last a full 20 seconds like Raiden's last even longer than that. So if you're slow in your rotations, practically Raiden can just give you more hyper blooms, and that really is relevant. Other characters that proc hyper bloom, something like Sino, or if people are using Yai and hyper bloom, these characters are fine, but they always have to be on field. Some people use Lisa, but being on field is so much more restrictive. The best thing about Kuki and Raiden is that they can be used off field. So I overall prefer Kuki, but there are definitely some positives to using Raiden. But Kuki being a 4-star and only needing her C2 to really reach max potential is really nice. For future prospects, I have a hard time seeing Hyper Bloom ever falling off. I think it'll remain one of the best free-to-play teams and low-investment teams in the game. I think it's just going to continue getting more and more options. Any new Hydro, Dendro character is going to work in Hyper Bloom, most likely. They all do so far, pretty much. So I really only see her staying the same, getting better. I mean, I don't think they're going to buff Hyper Bloom or anything. And it's possible in the future that we get a 5-star version of Kuki, I guess. So maybe we'll get some sort of 5-star character that is a healer that specializes in proccing hyper blooms and is just like a better version of Kuki. That's totally possible. It's kind of hard to imagine why they would do something like that, but it is definitely possible. And for Overworld and aesthetic, I mean, she's great in the Overworld. Being a healer is awesome. Being able, if you run hyper bloom team in the Overworld, having Kuki as your healer is awesome. Working with Yelan, you can slot Kazuha in the final slot of the hyper bloom team, and then you have Kazuha, Yelan, Kuki, Nahida. You can break multiple elemental check. You're not super burst reliant. You can just use Fav on Yelan. You got the healing. You got everything. So great Overworld character, doesn't need ER. Design is fantastic. Big fan of Kuki. She's one of the strongest characters in the game. Build her now. There's another broken 4-star character on this banner. It's Xiangling. My guide for her is right there. It's a fantastic guide. Make sure you check it out. Have fun building your teams, and bye for now.